The Battle of Kunersdorf, 1759. Frederick the Great's bitter defeat and the threat to Berlin. On August 12, 1759, one of the bloodiest and most decisive battles of the 7 Years' War erupted near the village of Kunersdorf, now Kunowice in modern-day Poland, just east of Frankfurt an der Oder. The clash involved nearly 100,000 troops from two major coalitions. On one side, the Prussian army led personally by King Frederick II, better known as Frederick the Great, and on the other, the allied forces of the Russian Empire and the Habsburg monarchy of Austria, commanded by General Pyotr Saltykov and Ernst Gideon von Lauden. The Battle of Kunersdorf was far more than an ordinary military engagement. It was the climax of long-simmering tensions between Europe's great powers, part of a global conflict known as the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, and regionally as the Third Silesian War. Thousands of lives were at stake, as was the very survival of Prussia and the political landscape of Europe. Strategic background: one kingdom, multiple fronts. Frederick the Great was facing pressure from nearly every direction. Though he had successfully bested Austria in the First and Second Silesian Wars, he was now up against a far more formidable coalition: Austria, Russia, France, and Sweden. Prussia, despite its military efficiency, lacked the manpower and financial resources to fight a prolonged multi-front war. By mid-1759, the Russians and Austrians had agreed to unite their forces and strike at the heart of Frederick's power. Pyotr Saltykov, commanding the Russian army, had captured Frankfurt an der Oder in early August and established a well-fortified defensive position near Kunersdorf. There, he joined forces with Austrian troops under Lauden, forming a combined army of approximately 59,500 men, 41,000 Russians and 18,500 Austrians. Realizing the danger posed by this union of forces so close to Berlin, Frederick determined to attack before they could march on Prussia's capital. With 50,900 troops, including some of his elite regiments, he marched toward Kunersdorf. The battlefield: hostile ground. The terrain around Kunersdorf was a nightmare for maneuver warfare. It featured sandy hills, small lakes, marshy ravines, and wooded areas. Far from ideal for Prussia's traditional strengths in fast cavalry charges and coordinated line attacks. Yet, Saltykov and Lauden had the advantage of time. Having reached the area first, they spent days fortifying their positions with trenches, redoubts, and well-placed artillery atop key ridgelines. Frederick's plan was to attack from the Allied right flank using his signature tactic, the oblique order, concentrating his forces on a specific section of the enemy line to overwhelm it before the rest could react. However, this time, the Russians and Austrians were ready. The battle begins, a promising start. At dawn on August 12th, the Prussians launched their assault from the west, attacking the Russian right near the Mühlberg Heights. The initial assault was a success. Russian forces were driven back, and their defensive positions overrun. For a few hours, it appeared as though Frederick might repeat his legendary victories at Lutal or Rossbach. But the Prussians were already beginning to suffer. The march to the battlefield had been exhausting. The summer heat was oppressive. Many soldiers had gone without food or water. Against the advice of his generals, Frederick pressed the attack, eager to crush the Russian center before the Austrians could deploy fully. The turning point: overextension and Allied resilience.
The Prussian advance into the Russian center was met with fierce resistance. Russian artillery, including heavy-caliber cannons, tore through the advancing Prussian ranks. Units that had just fought and marched for hours were ordered to attack fresh defensive lines without rest or coordination. By late afternoon, exhaustion and attrition had begun to take their toll. And just when Prussian momentum had slowed, Laudon unleashed a devastating counterattack from the Austrian left. His cavalry crashed into the depleted Prussian flanks, while fresh Russian infantry re-entered the fray. The battlefield descended into chaos. Entire Prussian formations disintegrated. Many officers were killed or captured. Even elite units such as the Garde du Corps were routed. Frederick's command structure collapsed. The king himself narrowly escaped death. His horse was shot out from under him, and he barely avoided capture. Despondent, he wrote to his ministers, "I believe everything is lost. We shall all perish." Total defeat, a Prussian disaster. By nightfall, the Prussian army had been obliterated. Of the 50,900 men Frederick brought into the battle, only about 3,000 remained with him by the end of the day. Thousands were dead, wounded, or missing. The field around Kunersdorf was covered in the bodies of fallen Prussian soldiers so densely that it was said one could barely walk without stepping on the dead. It was the single worst defeat of Frederick the Great's military career. Over 19,000 Prussians were killed outright, and more than 26,000 were killed, wounded, or captured. The Allies also suffered, losing some 15,000 men, but they had retained the field and, more importantly, shattered the Prussian main army. Why the Allies did not march on Berlin. With the road to Berlin wide open, only 80 kilometers away, and Prussia's main army in ruins, the war could have ended then and there. But the Russians and Austrians failed to capitalize on their victory. Several factors explain this. 1. Exhaustion and logistics. Both armies had suffered enormous casualties and lacked the supply lines to advance further. 2. Command disputes. Saltykov and Laudon disagreed on the next steps. The Russians were wary of outrunning their supply lines, and the Austrians lacked explicit orders to move on Berlin. 3. Overestimation of Prussian strength. They feared Frederick would quickly regroup, unaware of how close he had come to collapse. As a result, the Allied momentum was lost.
Historical consequences. The Battle of Kunersdorf marked the absolute nadir of Frederick's military fortunes. It was the only time in the entire 7 Years' War that the Prussian army under Frederick's direct command completely disintegrated on the battlefield. Discipline collapsed. Morale was crushed. Yet, paradoxically, the battle also signaled the limits of Allied cohesion. Despite their triumph, Russia and Austria failed to press their advantage. Their mutual distrust and conflicting objectives prevented a coordinated follow-up. Incredibly, Frederick recovered. Within weeks, he began assembling new forces. In 1760, a year after Kunersdorf, Empress Elizabeth of Russia died. Her successor, Tsar Peter III, admired Frederick and immediately withdrew Russia from the war, an event known as the Miracle of the House of Brandenburg. Epilogue: Defeat, Survival, and Legacy. Kunersdorf was a catastrophic defeat for Prussia, but it also highlighted Frederick's resilience. Though crushed on the battlefield, he survived politically and militarily, thanks as much to diplomatic fortune as to his personal determination. The Russians and Austrians had proven that Frederick was not invincible. Yet their inability to finish the job meant that Prussia lived to fight another day. Kunersdorf remains one of the bloodiest single-day battles of the 18th century. It is remembered not only for its massive casualties and tactical failures, but also for its far-reaching consequences on the war and European balance of power. It was the day the Prussian war machine broke, and the day a legend began to rise from the ruins.